Between 1347 and 1353, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Half of Europe's population vanished in less than a decade. Fields lay empty, cities fell silent. The foundations of medieval civilization collapsed. This was Europe in the 14th century, the most catastrophic 100 years in Western history. The year is 1337. King Edward III of England declares war on France, igniting the 100 Years' War. This single conflict becomes the catalyst for transformations that will reshape European civilization. What unfolds over the next 100 years will end the medieval world and give birth to the modern age. For 3 centuries, Europe had known prosperity. Populations grew, economies expanded, then without warning, everything changed. In 1315, the skies opened. An unseasonable cold snap brought torrential rains that destroyed crops across the continent. The Great Famine had begun. Hundreds of thousands starved. In some regions, desperation drove people to unspeakable acts. Cannibalism became a grim reality. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. The social fabric began to tear. But the famine was only the beginning. 20 years later, in the distant steppes of China, something far more deadly stirred. Bubonic plague, the Black Death, carried by fleas on rats traveling trade routes. It arrived in Italian ports in 1348. What followed can only be described as apocalyptic. Within 2 years, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population was dead. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Cities became charnel houses. The living could barely bury the dead. Survivors wandered through a landscape of corpses, wondering if God himself had abandoned humanity. And through it all, the wars never stopped. The 100 Years' War between England and France, the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in the east, crusades in the Baltic, the final push against the Moors in Spain, Mongol successor, states tearing themselves apart. The 14th century became the bloodiest period in European history, a perfect storm of famine, plague, and war that killed more people than any century before or since. Yet here's what makes this era truly fascinating. From this crucible of death and destruction emerged the modern world. The catastrophe didn't just destroy, it transformed everything. And we're going to see exactly how. Let's begin where Europa Universalis V begins, with England and France locked in mortal combat. But here's what most people misunderstand about the 100 Years' War. This wasn't a war between 2 nations, not at first. The Plantagenet kings of England were French. They spoke French, held French lands, and technically owed allegiance to the French crown as vassals. When Edward III claimed the French throne in 1337, he was essentially a rebellious nobleman making a property claim. This was medieval politics, a feudal family squabble blown up to continental scale, but something extraordinary happened as the war dragged on decade after decade. That feudal dispute slowly transformed into something new, a national war. English and French identities crystallized in opposition to each other. The conflict stopped being about which aristocrat owned which piece of land and became about England versus France as distinct peoples with distinct destinies. And the way they fought was changing too. At Crécy in 1346, something unprecedented occurred. The flower of French chivalry, the greatest knights in Christendom, charged against Edward's army. They were cut down nearly to a man, not by other knights, by Welsh peasants with longbows. Think about what this meant. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by mounted aristocratic warriors in expensive armor. Suddenly, disciplined commoners with simple weapons were more effective on the battlefield. The strategic value of the knight was evaporating before everyone's eyes, and it got worse for the old order. Later in the war, gunpowder artillery made its thunderous debut. Cannons began battering down castle walls that had stood impregnable for generations. The military foundations of feudalism, the armored knight and the fortified castle, were becoming obsolete. And when the military power of the aristocracy declined, their political power followed. The monarchies of England and France seized the opportunity, centralizing authority, building professional armies, and laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. The old feudal world was dying. The age of kings was dawning. While armies clashed in France, a different kind of revolution was unfolding in Italy. The Italian peninsula in the 14th century was the economic powerhouse of Europe, and the engines of that power were the merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, maritime city-states that had mastered the seas and controlled trade with the East. Since the Crusades, these Italian merchants had established commercial networks stretching from London to China along the Silk Road. They imported spices, silk, precious metals, exotic goods that European aristocrats craved, and they grew fantastically wealthy doing it. The merchants and bankers of Venice and Genoa became richer than kings. They built the largest navies in Europe. They colonized islands across the Mediterranean. They waged wars, not for land or glory, but for market share and trade routes. This was capitalism before the word existed. And here's the crucial part. The Black Death accelerated this transformation. When half the population died, labor became scarce. Suddenly, the surviving peasants had leverage. They could demand higher wages, better conditions. Many escaped serfdom entirely and migrated to cities. The feudal system, which depended on binding peasants to the land, began to collapse. Meanwhile, with so many landowners dead, property changed hands rapidly. Old aristocratic families found themselves economically overtaken by upstart merchants. Wealth was flowing away from hereditary land ownership and toward commerce and trade. The center of economic gravity was shifting from the countryside to the cities, from agriculture to commerce, from lords to merchants. Europe was transitioning from a feudal economy to a market economy, the early stirrings of the capitalist system that would eventually dominate the world. In the midst of catastrophe, the future was being born. Now, look at the center of the map, that chaotic scramble of borders in what's roughly modern Germany. That's the Holy Roman Empire, and it embodies everything paradoxical about this era. Voltaire would later quip that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But that misses the point. To medieval people, this institution mattered profoundly. The emperor claimed to be the successor of Charlemagne, ordained by the Pope to rule Christendom. In theory, he was the most powerful man in Europe. In practice, the Holy Roman Empire was a constitutional nightmare. Over 100 semi-independent kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, all theoretically under imperial authority, most of them effectively sovereign. And it kept getting worse. The emperor wasn't hereditary, he was elected by powerful nobles who extracted massive concessions in exchange for their votes. Every election weakened central authority further. The dysfunction reached absurd levels during the 100 Years' War. Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria allied with England. Meanwhile, his supposed vassal, John of Bohemia, fought and died on the French side at Crécy. The emperor and his vassal were fighting on opposite sides of a foreign war. While England and France were centralizing, becoming proto-nation states, the Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting. It would remain divided until Napoleon finally put it out of its misery in 1806. Germany wouldn't unify until 1871, but in Italy, which was technically part of the empire, something different was happening. Distance from the imperial heartland meant effective independence, and in that independence, Italian city-states flourished. This was the age of Dante and Petrarch, the bridge between medieval and Renaissance culture. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the Pope wasn't even home. In 1305, French pressure had forced the papacy to relocate to Avignon. This eventually led to the Western Schism, two competing popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming to be the true vicar of Christ. The unity of Christendom was an illusion. Europe was fragmenting into the competitive state system that would define modernity. While Western Europe tore itself apart, the eastern frontiers were equally violent, but for different reasons. In Iberia, the Christian kingdoms were in the final stage of the Reconquista against Islamic Moorish states. For 7 centuries, Christians and Muslims had fought for control of the peninsula. By 1337, only the Emirate of Granada remained in Muslim hands. In 1340, at the Battle of Salado, the combined armies of Castile and Portugal crushed a massive Moroccan invasion. It was the last time a Muslim army would ever invade Iberia. The Reconquista was entering its endgame, though Granada would hold on until 1492. Meanwhile, Portugal, Castile, and Aragon were centralizing rapidly, building powerful navies, preparing for the global colonial empires they would soon forge. Further east, a different drama was unfolding. Much of Eastern Europe remained under the so-called Tatar yoke, the domination of the Golden Horde, successor state to Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. The Slavic principalities of Rus paid tribute to the Mongol Khans and dreamed of freedom. Among them, the young Principality of Moscow was quietly gathering strength. The foundations of Russia were being laid. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights and Scandinavian Crusaders waged brutal wars against the last pagans of Europe. The forests of Lithuania and Prussia ran with blood as Christendom expanded through conquest and forced conversion. But the Lithuanians fought back ferociously. Not only did they resist the Crusaders, they went on the offensive, conquering Rus principalities and building one of the largest states in Europe. By the end of the century, a union between Poland and Lithuania would create a superpower dominating Eastern Europe. And in the Balkans, the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, was in terminal decline. The catastrophic Fourth Crusade had broken its back. Now, Serbs and Bulgarians carved away its European territories while a new power emerged in Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. In 1337, they were still a minor frontier beylik. By the century's end, they had conquered the Balkans. In 1453, they would take Constantinople itself, finally extinguishing the Roman Empire after more than 2,000 years. The medieval world order was collapsing on every front. So what do we make of the 14th century? By any measure, it was one of the worst periods in human history. Famine, plague, war, death on an almost incomprehensible scale. A catastrophe that killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Yet from that catastrophe came transformation. The Black Death broke the back of feudalism and serfdom. The 100 Years' War demonstrated that professional armies were superior to feudal levies. Gunpowder and longbows made aristocratic warriors obsolete. Merchants and bankers overtook landed nobility in wealth and influence. Monarchies centralized power at the expense of feudal lords. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies, its localized economies, its feudal obligations, was dying. The early modern world, with its nation-states, its global commerce, its standing armies, its centralized governments, was being born in fire and blood. This is why Europa Universalis V begins in 1337, because this is when everything changed. When players start their campaigns, they're not just playing a game, they're navigating one of history's great inflection points, the hinge between two ages. The crisis of the 14th century destroyed an old world and created a new one. It was apocalyptic. It was transformative. It was, in every sense, the end of one era and the beginning of another. And that's exactly what makes it such a perfect starting point for any grand strategy campaign, because you're not just managing a stable realm. You're trying to survive and thrive through the most turbulent century in European history, a century where the very rules of civilization were being rewritten in real time. The old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born. Now it's your turn to shape what comes next. If you found this exploration of history compelling, subscribe to our channel for more in-depth historical documentaries. Like this video to support our work and share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of the 14th century fascinates you most? We'll see you in the next episode.